My name is Brendan Cahill. I'd like to welcome you to this week's episode of our Humanitarian webinar series. Today's title is Ethics and Corruption in Humanitarian Operations by our dear friend Lex Tackenberg. The Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs is an independent center reporting directly to the president of Fordham University, and we act as a bridge between the humanitarian and the academic communities. We do this primarily through training. We have two graduate programs, the Master of Arts in International Humanitarian Action and the Master of Science in Humanitarian Studies. We also run independent training programs, as well as undergraduate majors and minors, both at Fordham's Lincoln Center and Rose Hill campuses. We have three areas of specific research: education in emergencies, humanitarian innovation and design through the Casa Azul program, and children in armed conflict. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lex Tackenberg today, a Dutch national. Lex has worked in various field and headquarters positions with the UN Relief Works Administration, UNRWA, since 1989, and was, until recently, based in Amman, where he occupied the post of Chief Ethics Office at UNRWA headquarters. Before joining UNRWA, he was the legal officer of the Dutch Refugee Council for 6 years, a law graduate from the University of Amsterdam. He obtained a doctorate in international law from the University of Nijmegen, the Netherlands, after having successfully defended his doctoral dissertation entitled The Status of Palestinian Refugees in International Law, which was published by Oxford University Press. The commercial edition of that dissertation in 1998. There was also a Arabic translation, which was published by the Institute of Palestinian Studies in 2003, and a new version of the book, co-authored with Francesca Albanese, was published also with Oxford University Press in 2020, in June of this year. Lex has been a lecturer for our IDHA programs throughout the world before, and he will be teaching our upcoming Integrity, Accountability, and Transparency in Humanitarian Operations course, which will be online at Fordham in this spring. Lex, it's over to you. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Brandon, for your words of introduction, and for the Institute and Camille for making all the arrangement, and great to see so many people from around the world joining the webinar. I will, in half an hour, give some sort of overview of some key ethics and sort of corruption considerations with respect to humanitarian operations. And this is obviously based on my experience over the last decade as Chief of UNRWA's Ethics Office, but also enriched by close interactions with the ethics community around the world, both in the private sector and in the public, national public and international public sector. So what I like to do is talk a little bit about the importance of ethics and integrity for humanitarian work, then talk a little bit more about some of the common ethical challenges that humanitarian workers are facing, and finally look at some key areas of corruption, some key corruption risk areas pertaining to humanitarian operations, and a few comments around it. I sort of try to limit my comments to half an hour, and then we'll be more than happy to take your questions. First, a few remarks about the importance of ethics for humanitarian work. I mean, ethics is generally, if we talk about an organizational setting, and even beyond organizations. Ethics is about integrity in human relationships, integrity as we interact with our families, with our community, with our friends, with our associations, and also in the workplace. It's therefore no exception that no surprise that ethics is also key to humanitarian work in a number of ways that are sort of generic to all organizational settings, as well as in ways that are sort of unique to the humanitarian context. First, and I think most importantly, ethics brings credibility and respect from the various stakeholders that humanitarian actors need to engage in, whether they're donors, host authorities, government interlocutors, partners, vendors, beneficiaries, others, whoever you need to work with to implement the mission of the humanitarian organization you work for is enhanced by doing the job with credibility and with ethics and integrity. Ethics also provides guidance in a situation where sometimes the legal framework does not give immediate answers to a situation that you need to deal with. There can be situations that sort of the rules are considered unethical themselves. There can be conflicting sets of rules. There can be ambiguity in the rules, and then ethics and integrity provide a framework for nevertheless sort of reaching the right situation for the challenge you're facing, and this especially also counts for emergency situation where a humanitarian actor comes into a terrain where the legal framework is not clear, and immediate decisions need to be made. So ethics is there sort of the lighthouse to guide appropriate action. And importantly, in organizations, ethics helps to build an ethical culture, and as part of building that ethical culture, managers and supervisors, by acting with integrity, they make it safe for their teams to do the right thing. They create sort of the beam within which the day-to-day actions of the mission are being implemented. Zooming in a little bit more on this ethical culture, an ethical culture is an organizational culture that is characterized by transparency, by accountability, by integrity. And there are roughly 4 sets of drivers and who that interact with each other, and that in conjunction, contribute to an organizational culture that is indeed, can be considered sort of ethical. One is ethical leadership. I already mentioned it. Leaders sort of set the tone for those they supervise, for those they lead, to do the right thing, or otherwise, in the absence of ethical leadership, to prevent from staff doing the right thing. So that's a key driver of an ethical culture. Leading by example, commit to the vision of the organization, foster teamwork, etc. Then, of course, there are the rules, that the regulatory framework in which the organization operates, the applicable national laws, applicable international conventions, the mandate, codes of conduct, regulations and rules, policies, SOPs. They are, adherence to the regulatory framework generally contributes to an ethical organization, an organization that functions ethically. And similarly, a lot of these, regulatory instruments put in place processes that help to guide ethical decision-making of the organization. Recruitment processes sort of are intended to limit nepotism in hiring decisions, and make sure that the best person is hired for the job. Similarly, procurement processes, financial processes, processes for determining eligibility and entitlement, how conflicts of interest are managed, how stakeholders are engaged. All of these contribute, again, with the other elements to nurturing an ethical culture. And finally, there is the importance of ethical awareness. It's great to have a strong regulatory framework and sound processes, but if personnel and other stakeholders are not aware of them, it may not sufficiently penetrate the way they operate in the organization, and the interaction between the organization and its external stakeholders. So ethical awareness through awareness sessions, through the provision of confidential advice by an ethics office, an ombudsman, in an NGO setting, a meal coordinator, online training, and so forth, all contribute to raising ethical awareness. And as I said, these four interact and sort of reinforce each other. And if you can say the ethical culture is as strong as the weakest link in the organization. So let me turn from here to a number of ethical challenges that humanitarian workers are frequently confronted with, and I'm limiting it here to 7, summarizing some areas in view of the time available, but it just gives you an idea. And by the way, we will be sharing the PowerPoint slides with you, so you will have the benefit of being able to look at it after the presentation, after the session today. So the first set of challenges relates to the interplay between the organization and humanitarian workers and state actors. State actors primarily sort of host authorities in the country or countries where humanitarian action is taking place, as well as donor governments that finance the humanitarian action, and in the process of financing one could possibly interfere. So interference both from host government officials and from donor representative is a real challenge that humanitarian actors need to sort of juggle. The starting point is that humanitarian goals and mission come first, not the interest of individual states. Although, of course, it's a fine line how the two differ, and of course, I'm not arguing that humanitarian actors should ignore the interest or the interactions with state actors, but it can represent a challenge, and in that context, be aware that what you say and do is perceived as your organization speaking and acting. So be careful in your interaction with state actors as to the content of your messaging. In that context, be very careful not to sort of solicit, accept, or follow instructions from government representatives. Once a sort of concession is done in a humanitarian operation, it's very difficult to roll it back. In the case of UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, for which I worked for so many years, in the early 50s, shortly after the organization's establishment, some concessions were given to the government of Jordan and Syria to have government representatives on selection panels for staff recruitment. And up to that moment, you know, these concessions are in place, and of course this is hampering the independence of UNRWA's ability to hire the staff that it needs to carry out the operations. So be very careful with making concessions to government representatives, especially if you're not sure whether these are in the best interest of the humanitarian operation, and you know, involve headquarters if necessary. You know, if you do not want to sort of, you know, to offend the government interlocutors with respect to an issue that they feel strong about, and you're not sure whether you can accept this. You know, tell them that, you know, this is not in your power, and you may need to consult your headquarters. In this context, also be careful with respect to gifts or honors from governments. In principle, we should not give, we should not receive, to maintain the independence of the humanitarian operation. Sometimes you're in a ceremony where, you know, you're being presented with some sort of a gift, a platter or a plaque or a sign or what have you, and you know that it can be embarrassing to refuse. In which situations, you know, it can be accepted on behalf of your organization, but you should report it and where appropriate turn over the gift to management. So these are some of the key issues with respect to state actors, humanitarian workers get involved in. Then issues of outside employment and activities. You would say, you know, I'm as an expatriate humanitarian worker, you know, I'm working 24/7 for the humanitarian mission. So it may not be, you know, there may not be time for any outside employment, but you know, you work in partnership with locally recruited humanitarian workers for whom the situation may be very different. You know, you may have hired people who are good, but at some point you discover that they may have a job on the side, and that is something that can represent conflicts of interest. So the basic principle is that nobody should have a second job unless they have disclosed this and obtained approval of the country director or head of mission or headquarters, depending on the rules in place. This also applies, and this is also typically, you know, significant for local humanitarian personnel. You know, service on boards or in an expert capacity with the government or an outside organization. Once again, it's not a no. It may be very, you know, if you have an educational specialist working in your operation who is known as an expert in curriculum development, and the government wants to have that person, you know, on a curriculum development board, you know, that may be you know, that may also be in the interest of the humanitarian operation if there is that interaction. But it should be disclosed, and the management of the organization should have the opportunity to consider this carefully and see whether they want to get along with this. And then there are certain other sort of outside activities needing prior approval of the organization. In the UN, that's quite strictly regulated. In most international NGOs, that's the same. especially if these are not part of your normal duties. You know, issue statements to the press is something that is reserved for the spokespersons, for the communication officers, and not for other personnel. Accept speaking engagements, take part in films, theater, radio, or television productions, submit articles, books, or other material for publication. Rationale behind it is once again to make sure that these outside activities do not conflict with the humanitarian mandate or the implementation of the humanitarian mission. Okay, private conduct and social activities. You know, our private time is in principle ours. We contract with the organization to give it a limited number of hours, and we are entitled to have privacy and free time and use that as we deem appropriate. But in a humanitarian context, humanitarian personnel's off-duty personal social conduct still reflects on the organization and the wider community. If humanitarian expat workers in a religious Muslim community are sort of seen drinking, going to the pub, and walking around loud under the influence of alcohol, you know, this may have a significant impact on how the not only the personnel of the organization, but even the wider humanitarian community is perceived. So in a humanitarian setting, you know, there is really a very blurred line between the official and the private part of your conduct. Humanitarian organizations, talking about alcohol, you know, have strong policies regarding the use of alcohol and drugs, as well as sexual conduct, sexual misconduct in particular. We're all aware of policies on sexual exploitation and abuse of beneficiaries, as well as sexual harassment in the workplace. You know, sexual misconduct has unfortunately, in the humanitarian sector, has unfortunately drawn a lot of attention over the past decade, you know, there's not enough time to embark on it in the scope of this presentation, but it's an issue that I care a great deal about, and that in the online course that we're developing will get a separate module. Humanitarian workers should use discretions in remarks that could be interpreted as public statements or commitments. You know, if you're having coffee with people in the lobby of a hotel, and you know, you're making statements that sound like, you know, this is what the organization is going to do. You know, you have to be aware that there may be a journalist there or a government official or who have you, you know, who may overhear you, and believe that this is a, you know, a commitment with respect to the organization. And finally, always remember that being a humanitarian worker does not accept us from observing local laws, such as traffic regulation, nor does it provide an excuse to ignore private legal or financial obligations. Political activities and neutrality. You're aware that neutrality is one of the humanitarian principles which, you know, were developed in the Red Cross and Red Crescent family, but have since been adopted by the UN and by the entire humanitarian community, essentially implying that humanitarian personnel must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. So that is a key principle, and in the heat of sort of the conflict in which you may end up, it's one of the most difficult challenges of humanitarian work to manage, especially where the humanitarian organization employs a lot of local staff who are drawn from the community that is part and parcel of the ongoing conflict. And that was very much the case with UNRWA, which has a Palestinian workforce of, or more than 99% of the total UNRWA workforce are Palestinians. And in trainings I gave on neutrality, I always said, neutrality sucks. If you're confronted with situations of injustice, especially if this affects the personnel directly or indirectly, you have the urge to speak out and to take sides. And Nelson Mandela used to say, choosing or remaining neutral in the face of injustice is unethical. He's quite right, but for humanitarian actors to have access to both sides of a conflict, to have the confidence of the host authorities, of donors, and of other stakeholders, and particularly also beneficiaries, neutrality is of critical importance. And yes, it is an infringement of sort of our freedom of speech, which we have as human beings, but it's an infringement that, follows from the employment relationship that with a humanitarian organization that you're consciously entering into. And therefore, as a result of being a humanitarian worker, we must avoid political activities that could reflect negatively on the organization and the wider humanitarian community, and exercise discipline over the public expression of our opinions at all times, including on websites and social media. Social media these days is the place where we express anger, frustration with the affairs of the world, whether it is what happens with the political scenario in the US to the Middle East, to the Caucasus, etc. So social media is typically an area where neutrality comes in and where we need to exercise discipline over the public expression of our opinions. And yes, it is an infringement of freedom of movement, but it's one that we make as humanitarian workers for the greater good of the humanitarian operation. That is the way I typically explain it when I do dedicated training on neutrality and political activities. Financial and business interest. Once again, an issue where you say, is that a big issue for me as a humanitarian worker? Probably not, but once again, you operate alongside significant numbers of locally recruited personnel for whom this may be different. They may have relationships, or their family members may have relationships with implementing partners, with suppliers, with host authorities that have the potential to create conflicts of interest. So you need to be aware of them and to mitigate them. The typical rule is any potential or actual or perceived conflict of interest needs to be disclosed by those who face this conflict, and then it's up for the manager to mitigate, to decide how to resolve it. Normally by recusing the person from the transactions in question. If it's a procurement transaction and a relative is amongst the companies that is interested to bid for that contract, then the member of personnel that has that family relationship should be recused from the buying decision, from the procurement decision. In that context, if we talk about interactions with vendors, with suppliers, do never accepts gifts, gratuities, or favors of any kind from suppliers or those who are seeking business with the organization. For a long time, there was a sort of nominal gift, nominal favor rule, which created a slippery slope. You know, what is nominal in what's a couple of dozen of dollars in the West, maybe 2 week salary in other parts of the world. So it's a slippery slope and unresolved, you know, gifts and there's nothing like a free lunch with a supplier, and effectively it creates sort of explicit or implicit, you know, commitments that may ultimately, you know, amount to corruption if they're not addressed. Depending on the organization you work for, you may have to disclose your and your family members' financial and business interests. That's definitely the case for a lot of personnel in the UN and also in some of the larger international NGOs. And at all times, make sure that financial and business interests, not only of yourself, but also of your staff and implementing partners, do not conflict or appear to conflict with the humanitarian mission. Family members and related issues, you know, a family member working with the same organization or with an implementing partner or with a government can create a conflict of interest and therefore needs to be disclosed and mitigated. And I mention here briefly a couple of situations where it's really important to seek advice, you know, spouses, romantic partners, and relatives who are staff members. You know, this often gives a lot of tensions. Eligibility and entitlement decisions where your local staff have sort of may come across local relatives, you know, they have to recuse themselves. Romantic and sexual relationships between colleagues, business interests, spouse or children's employment or affiliation with state actors, NGOs, etc. And then one of the most difficult ones is where you're confronted as a humanitarian worker, whether you're a manager, supervisor, or whether you're in another role. You may receive grievances of unethical behavior. People may report misconduct. There may be a request that certain acts be investigated. You may be a witness, you know, and you don't really know what to do with it. But the important thing is that you don't ignore such report and observations and do take prompt action. You know, if you can address the matter yourself, do so. If you're not sure, seek advice from your supervisor, from the country director, from headquarters if necessary, from a meal coordinator, from the ethics office where there is such an office, or the ombuds office. Do not sort of sit on it because you're not sure what to do. If there is a complaint about you, immediately notify your supervisor. This way you will protect yourself and you will protect the staff members involved. If there is a concern about you, about your operation, you know, it may get you angry and you may have the urge to retaliate against those who raise those concerns, and that's a human urge. But similar to the urge to speak out in the face of injustice, here is one where you have to put a brake on your emotions and realize that it's in the best interest of the organization and therefore of the humanitarian operation that staff members can freely speak up if they believe there is something wrong. So do not retaliate. And a final comment here, a grievance that can be resolved at an early stage if you're confronted as a manager, as a co-worker with colleagues who fight in the office. A grievance that can be resolved, at an early stage in a few minutes or an hour, has the potential to escalate in protracted conflicts requiring enormous efforts to address. Unattended conflict has the tendency to mushroom in massive problems for the organization, for you yourself. So if you're confronted with conflict and you have the ability to deal with it, deal with it immediately. Don't let it mushroom. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. I'm speaking for half an hour, so I will be very brief about some of the key corruption areas. And I give you some very useful resources in the last slide that can help you to go in obtain additional information. Very briefly, how corruption affects humanitarian operations. It's the flip side of how ethics is important to humanitarian operations. Corruption deprives beneficiaries of resources and access to services and causes them to lose confidence. For the organization, it reduces available resources and causes damage to their reputation. It destroys donors' trust in the humanitarian actors' ability to deliver. It may encourage other personnel to engage in fraudulent activities and demoralizes those who diligently perform their work. So it's really, something, yes, that is key to humanitarian work as it is in general to organization. So very briefly, what is corruption? The first bullet point gives you the legal definition, the offering, giving, receiving, or soliciting directly or indirectly anything of value to influence improperly the actions of another party. That is taken from the common definition of the international finance institutions. The term corruption is used in American English. In British English, it's bribery. Transparency International, the main association of NGOs dealing with the main platform of NGOs dealing with corruption issues, defines corruption simply as an abuse of power for personal gain, an abuse of power for personal gain, and anything of value or personal gain may include, money, gifts, fees, fuel, sex for services, sex for employment, time, loans, promises of future payments or commission, tax exemptions, employment, services, etc. And in view of this, corruption can take many shapes and forms, and it can be financial and non-financial, and it very often happens in conjunction with fraud. Now, I have a slide here that sort of shows you that corruption is a subset of misconduct, of organizational misconduct more generally, and the typical distinction between corruption and other forms of misconduct is the personal gain. If it is an abuse of the authority that you have and come with your job to get something of it outside your paycheck, then it is corruption. If there is no personal gain, there can still be, acts of organizational wrongdoing that are perpetrated because you want to cut corners, because you're in a bad mood, because of other reasons. Where there is no immediate personal gain at stake. By whom can acts of corruption occur, and when? Corruption can be committed by people inside the organization, by external parties such as vendors, implementing partners, governments, but also refugees and beneficiaries. We've all heard of entitlement fraud, for example, or duplicate registrations, etc. And then there can also be collusion between two or more parties in the corrupt act. And these parties can either be both internal, there can also be an internal party colluding together with an external actor in corrupt practices. And corruption can essentially occur at any time and anywhere over the lifetime of an operation or a program or a project. And it's contrary to what is often thought, you know, it is not just in support functions such as procurement and HR and construction and finance, but also very much in the program cycle itself where corruption can take place. Now here is a sort of a high level overview of sort of key risk areas of corruption risk in humanitarian operation, in the support functions, procurement, logistics, human resources, finance, construction contract management, very, very significant one, IT systems, but also the program cycle, needs assessment, allocation of resources, selection of partners and other local intermediaries, targeting and registering beneficiaries, distribution, post-distribution, program monitoring and evaluation can also be corrupt with false performance data being used. There can also be program-specific corruption risk. In UNRWA's case, there is a huge education and health program, and there are very unique corruption risks pertaining to such programs. So this gives you at the highest level an overview, and I'm not making this up myself. Transparency International, the organization that I already mentioned, has been doing a lot of work on corruption in the humanitarian sector. And about 7-8 years ago, they published a really useful handbook on preventing corruption in humanitarian operations. That handbook is now in a second edition and it's available in several languages. And I put a link on this slide. And then very usefully, they also created phone apps with the full text of the handbook in a phone app format, very easy to access. And all these various risk areas and the risks within these larger organizational sectors, you can, you know, watch it when you're at an aeroplane or you're waiting for a flight or whatever, you know, or when you quickly need to look it up. They're great apps, both available on the App Store and on Google Play if you look at preventing corruption in humanitarian operations. And finally, the content of the handbook was also the basis of an e-course that is available through the learning website of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And it's available in English, Arabic, French, and Spanish. Really, if you haven't already looked at it, download as a minimum the apps on your phone. You will find it very, very useful. On that note, I'm very happy to take your questions. Sorry for running a bit longer and therefore reducing the question time, but I thought it was useful to give you the benefit of this information.
Thank you very much, Lex. I would ask everyone on the chat to send their questions into the host or to me privately, either way. And what we do is we gather those questions and then bring them in order or bundle them together. I do have to say it's wonderful to see so many friends from across the world, names that I haven't seen in a long time, from New York, from Yemen, from Europe, from the Middle East. I wanted to start, you know, in my own privilege of hosting this, Lex, is Transparency International was founded in '93, and that first ODI report came out in 2008. In your opinion, Lex, where are we in the humanitarian sector in regards to corruption? Are we doing better? Are we doing worse? Are we still the same? So maybe if we start with that, as I wait for the other questions to come in.
Okay, very good question. I do believe that a lot has happened to raise awareness through the important work of Transparency International, including by making, by publishing this handbook and all the work around it. Also in terms of systems, there has been a lot of attention on strengthening whistleblower protection across the world. It's one of the key issues that TI has also advocated for, but also the UN has taken very seriously, and Guterres, only weeks after becoming the Secretary General, strengthened the whistleblower protection bulletin of the Secretariat. And in my own organization, UNRWA, there was unfortunately a senior leadership scandal involving a lot of abuse of authority and mismanagement. And personnel did feel comfortable to come to the ethics office and to the oversight people. And rather than this sort of either being unaddressed or going through the media and doing a lot of harm, was addressed through the internal mechanisms. It was raised with the Secretary General. It resulted in an OIOS investigation, and all the people concerned were gone. Similarly, the whole domain of sexual exploitation and abuse, which TI refers to as the most ugly form of corruption, and I think they're right. Abusing vulnerable beneficiaries of protection and aid, for sexual gain, is indeed a horrible form of corruption. I believe also there, across the humanitarian sector, there has been much more awareness, much more realization that, it's not good enough to say we have a policy and then leave it at that. And then when there is the next scandal, we say, we will hire a consultant, revisit the policy, and, issue version 2.0. No, there is much more real work in addressing this. So I really believe, as I mentioned, corruption has so many faces and so many colors and so many manifestations that it will, I think it's enshrined in the human experience, so to speak. So it will never totally disappear. But I believe a lot has been done to strengthen integrity in the humanitarian sector, sort of following suit with similar trends in the broader organizational sector, both in the private sector as a result of huge scandals, as well as in the national public sector and as a result of the Convention on Corruption, the International Convention Against Corruption.
Thanks, Lex.
Much more to be done, but yeah.
There's a number of questions coming in, and I want to be conscious of time. Have you found in your experience that different cultures hold different ethical values, or have core ethical standards remain constant across the humanitarian landscape? And maybe if I could append to that, in terms of corruption, who would also hold corrupt officials accountable in humanitarian operations, right? So if you're working in such a culture.
Okay. In terms of values, yes, there are different values in different cultures and geographical settings. And I've always been teaching that humanitarian personnel should be sensitive to those values and should avoid acting in violation of those values. However, and this is also the line taken in the standards of conduct of the United Nations, where a local value or practice directly conflicts with a human rights norm that has been adopted by the appropriate organs of the United Nations, that human rights norm takes precedence. So if we are in a situation where gender discrimination is still prevalent, as it is in the Middle East, where I've gained most of my work experience, our personnel are not expected to take that as a given. Our personnel are expected, and we do that through our programs and through our public advocacy and through our protection work, to advocate for the principles that are enshrined in the on gender equality in the various human rights instruments, to which the countries in questions have all been parties. So that's the test. Respecting local values to the extent they do not conflict with human rights norms that have been adopted and are enforced for the countries in question. How to hold corrupt officers accountable? I mean, it depends very much from sort of the context. The key thing is to report the conduct of those officers to those who are in a position to hold them accountable. If they are officials of the UN or of a humanitarian actor, it's important that this gets reported to headquarters so that the organization can take action. Similarly, if they are government officials of whom whose cooperation you require in order to have access to a vulnerable population, yes, you have to consider what are your options to hold such people accountable. Is it possible to, and this is a judgment call that the head of the humanitarian operation, often if it's in a complex emergency where there are multiple humanitarian actors, where you ideally can raise this with the UN resident representative. As we know, one of Guterres' reforms was to have dedicated full-time UN representatives who also have the humanitarian coordination role, so they can take it up at the highest levels possible in theory. But there may be situations where in an emergency you have to sort of tolerate a corrupt officer by sharing some food, or by accepting that they intervene to get your humanitarian mission completed. So it can be a difficult one, but in principle, trying to address corrupt officials is trying to engage those who are in a position to hold them to account.
Thanks, Lex. A number of questions similar questions have come in regarding whistleblowers and whistleblower protection. So if I might list them, and then you could respond to them in kind. So not all organizations have whistleblower protections or policies in protection for retaliation. In these cases, what can be done to protect a staff member who wants to come forward to denounce corruption or misconduct? Why are colleagues afraid to speak up despite the policy of whistleblower protection? And another one really along those lines of what can be done to protect the whistleblower. So there are organizations that obviously have corruption teams, and there are others that don't. So how can we protect those who want to question corruption and ethics in general?
Well, let me start by saying whistleblower protection is still very much in its infancy as an organizational discipline, including in the humanitarian sector. And it's also one of the more difficult aspects of sort of an ethics role or an integrity role where organizations have a dedicated role for that. You know, I've been chief of ethics at UNRWA for a decade, and protecting whistleblower has been by far the most difficult part of my work. Whistleblowers are easily associated with being troublemakers. Sort of management, you know, can attack the protector, saying, you know, you're getting it all wrong, and why would you, you know, try to protect those troublemakers? In situations where there are no policies, but even in situations where there are policies, if staff have concerns about wrongdoing and want to do something about it, avoiding retaliation, I would often recommend that they raise those concerns anonymously, but with sufficient detail that the organization can do something about it. You know, if it's not known who the whistleblower is, you know, those who you report about, you know, have sometimes they can guess who may be behind it, but that's you know, one of the best ways to protect. And sometimes I have made the report on behalf of the whistleblower and told the organization, you know, I knew who the whistleblower was, but I was not at liberty to disclose their identity. So confidentiality is one. Of course, that only works for sort of those kinds of corruption where you're not sort of directly a victim. If you're talking about sexual abuse, where you're the immediate you know, survivor, of course this is much more difficult. But I've also seen situations whereby there has been a pattern of sexual abuse, you know, a combination of sexual harassment and even SEA, and whereby a number of women came forward sort of as a group, but remaining their individual identities, you know, anonymous, and the organization had been able to take action. Why are people still afraid to speak up? I think that's because it is still in its infancy. It's not that easy to protect people effectively, but even more than fear of retaliation, what is the biggest obstacle to people coming forward is what experience learn is you know, concerns that reporting it may be futile, you know, that nothing may happen, that the organization doesn't care. So for organizations that want to improve sort of a speak up culture, making it safer for staff to come forward, it is important not only to sort of try to effectively protect whistleblowers, but also to have transparency about what is done with reports of wrongdoing that reach the higher echelons of the organization. You know, we know that investigations may take a lot of time, and that's you know, that's bad, and it's also good at the same time, because due process is very important. But you know, it's important that organizations are transparent as to what is happening, to the extent, that confidentiality rules, but it's never good to, to totally hide behind confidentiality rules. There are always basic information that can be shared. So yeah, very much what can be practically done. I mean, there's a whole range of measures. If there is an ethics office, the ethics office can recommend management interventions to get, the persons who are subject to retaliation out of harm's way, temporarily transfer them, place them on special leave, let them leave the country, depending really on the circumstances. Sometimes there is a risk of outside retaliation for, not within the organization, but by third parties. And there, we, as ethics officer, have worked closely with our security personnel, with gender colleagues in situations where there was retaliation in relation to sexual misconduct victims. So there is a lot that can be done, but it remains still very much a learning process and something that I believe will gradually enhance, similar to a kind of trajectory that we have seen with protection in the humanitarian sector over the past 25 years or so.
Thanks, Lex. We really have time for one more. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Is there a formula for balancing humanitarian principles with practical issues relating to access? For example, we commit to providing needs-based assistance, but is getting permission to access the most vulnerable providing something of value to those who are not the most valuable? So in another question, they talked about working with armed actors who've said you can have access to this population as long as you give supplies here. Could you talk about we'll end this on an ethical example, if we may.
Yeah, difficult one. This is really where, as a humanitarian worker, you're placed in a humanitarian dilemma, balancing the different humanitarian principles. I mean, the humanitarian imperative flowing from the principle of humanity with the principles of operational independence, impartiality, and neutrality. And yeah, I don't think there is really a fine answer. It's on a case-by-case basis for the humanitarian personnel to make that judgment call based on sort of their best appreciation of the circumstances. And what is important, I think, is that even in emergency situations where you may be stuck at checkpoints, with today's communication, it is almost, without exception possible to consult professionals who are at headquarters or in the same sector, or like in the UN, we had both an ethics panel of the specialized agencies around the Secretariat, as well as a broader ethics network of multilateral organizations. And almost no day passed without any of us sort of consulting the group and say, we have this difficult dilemma. What do we do? And tapping into the collective wisdom of peers who are able to reflect on the situation from a distance, can be tremendously helpful. I've already mentioned, you know, escalating a situation to headquarters. You know, if armed actors are sort of demanding a share of support, etc. You know, you can, depending on the circumstances, you know, it may be possible for you to escalate this to headquarters to provide you with cover. There was another one that that came to mind, but that escapes me now. Sorry.
That's okay. I think that's a good place to end. We live in an imperfect world. We're confronted with these ethical issues on a day-to-day basis. But the fact that there are structures, that there are handbooks, that there are guidelines that we can refer back to is something that should give us a little bit of solace during these dark days. Lex, I'd like to, first of all, thank you for giving time to this. Do you have any other sort of final remarks before we turn over to Camille?
No, thank you very much. Yeah, on the last point, I was just thinking, you know, you have to consider what power do you have over the over those who are trying to interfere. And in UNRWA's case, with armed attacks on installations, we sometimes have taken the you know, extreme step to suspend operations, you know, to really make a signal to those interfering that this is not acceptable. So just wanted to leave you with that thought, and thank you very much. I mean, this was obviously a very sort of brief overview of something I can talk about for days and days and days, and I'm very excited about having your invitation to develop an online course on I think we call it integrity, transparency, and accountability in humanitarian operations. And so those who want to know more, beside the resources that I mentioned from Transparency International, I look forward to having you on the course.